Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing the 25.17 support tier list. So if you enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Most notably, we saw a buff towards Morgana. It was primarily mid-skewed, but it does help her a bit in support. We also saw a buff to Senna, 20 healing on the Q, combined with a bit more attack speed growth, which is quite nice for the champion. Definitely benefited her in support. We also saw a buff towards Horizon Focus. The item lost 50 golden cost and went up by 10 AP. It now looks like a pretty appealing option for Vel'Koz and competitive for Xerath with some of his other options. Axiom Arc is the only other one which really matters for support. It had a price reduction of 250. I think Pyke looks pretty promising with the item. It is pretty competitive with some of his items later on into his build, so it's definitely worth considering. Now let's get into it. So the D tier is going to consist of the same champions, except for I've removed MF because no one's really, outside of like very low MMR brackets, MF support's really just, it hasn't been that much of a thing for a while now, so I'm just gonna remove it from the list, and so it's not cluttering too much. The other D tier champions remain the same. Twitch still doesn't perform that well in support, even with the shift over to the right keystone in PTA. His performance isn't great. It's primarily played by OTPs. I just wouldn't really recommend it. Malphite and Veigar, obviously the two gimmick picks in the support role. Malphite primarily paired with the Yasuo, Veigar paired with the Ziggs. Veigar in the past has been a viable support. That was when utility items were more effective on him, and a lot more of his kit was just baseline AP scalers rather than these like level AP scalers, which he now has to kind of push him out of the bot lane role towards mid lane. Right now, support Veigar just isn't a pick I would really recommend. And then Ashe, I think if you can pilot the pick really well, there are angles where you can maybe get away with it, but it still performs really bad, like just for average play. Honestly, if Ashe isn't played by like the best players in the world, it's probably just not a pick which I'd ever really consider, because you have to pilot it at such a high level of precision to really get value out of the kind of abusive laning phase it has, and then the kind of pick potential later on, like with the control, with the E. It's just a pick I wouldn't really recommend. So for C tier then, Yuumi leads us off. Yuumi obviously got pretty heavily nerfed in the previous patch in 25.16, lost a lot of her scaling, which is kind of the thing which in the previous patch to that was kind of keeping her up, was the fact that even though she is a weaker early game champion and you're giving up a lot of agency opting into her, she scales really well, and now some of that has been kind of pulled back. It's just a pick I wouldn't really recommend that much. I think she's still playable. Like, I have her in the C tier, and if you pick her with the right pairings and you understand kind of what you want to do with the champion, then I think she can benefit from that. But overall, I would just recommend looking towards other champions now. Amumu is being buffed for support in 25.18, so a pick which I would actually say is worth watching now. So Amumu support, it's not in the greatest of states. It doesn't have the kind of like items it wants. It's also limited by the fact that previous iterations of support Mumu had like the 30 mana cost Q, and I believe there was more CD on the Q, and maybe the base damage was slightly higher. What they're doing now is, I believe they are changing the Q mana cost from 45 to 65 to just a flat 50. So it's actually like weaker level 1, but like after you get points in it, it still stays at the same kind of level, and then the CD on the ability goes down a bit later on. So QMax Amu looks appealing as a support option going into next patch. Might be a B tier. Honestly, he's easy to play, and if like MF obviously got buffed in the previous patch, or actually in this patch, kind of like rises him up as like an option, might even be bumped up to the A tier. So yeah, watch Amumu. Currently I wouldn't recommend picking him, but definitely into next patch, paired alongside the right marksman, there is consideration there, and he's easy to play, so you don't need to put a huge amount of practice into him to kind of get results out. Renata, outside of like specific pairings, unless you're comfortable with a champion, I just wouldn't really recommend it. There are, I'd say, counterpick situations where you maybe don't need quite as much practice as like a borderline OTP kind of thing. But if you're not comfortable with a champion, then it's just a pick I'd recommend avoiding. I think they need to do something with Renata, as her pick rate's pretty abysmal and she's pretty gated by certain things, and then it's like competitively skewed as an extension of that. Silas sits within the C tier. I think if you're someone who's very comfortable playing Silas and you understand why you want to play it in support, like into like a Leona Vara Varus maybe, like two pretty valuable ults which you can get out of it, then yeah, I think there's like merit to playing side of support. You do need to snowball on the champion, and if you're not comfortable, then I would just recommend completely avoiding it. But it's there. It's like an option, something you can opt into. Mel is the other champion of the C tier. I believe if you Emax, she probably gets bumped up to the B tier. I don't think she's like a bad support by any means. She obviously wants gold. She, to an extension, wants XP to kind of like bump up her kit, because her kit does have genuine power within it, and support obviously is going to be one of the worst roles for that, but overall I think for Snare on the E, it's quite powerful. She has good harass, her tools aren't bad for like a support champion, so I think she can competitively compete with some of the B and A tier options. Moving on to the B tier, then we lead off with Tahm Kench. I don't like Tahm Kench support. I think it's like Tahm Kench as a champion is pretty gold heavy at the moment. Like, if you're not playing Tahm Kench as like someone who can do damage, then he just becomes an ult bot, and at that point I think he's just bad for solo queue. Like, I just would recommend completely avoiding him. Like, if you're playing ult bot Tahm Kench, I think for solo queue he's like a C, but basically even a D tier champion. Like, he just isn't good enough when you play him like that to like win games consistently. But if you play him with like your heart still, you're playing for like some level of individual agency, then I think he gets bumped up to like a B and can compete with some of the A tier options. But you do need to pick him in the right spots, and if you're not comfortable playing Tahm Kench, then it's probably just not worth playing him altogether at the moment. Teemo support doesn't put out bad numbers. For a while now, Teemo support has looked decent. I think if you're comfortable with the champion and you can pick him in the right spots, then he is a genuine support pick. Obviously, the higher up you go, the more you'll be punished for like your your lack of hard CC, your inability to kind of like check for vision. But you do have other things which kind of Teemo excels at. Like, the blind is a really valuable tool. The shrooms are really valuable for like control over objectives. And I think in like mid elo, where if you understand how to pilot your champion, like, is the main thing, it can be like really valuable. Then Teemo is like a legitimate decent option at the moment. Gallo, have him in the B tier, also a victim of just not having the greatest items at the moment. I don't think he's a bad support, especially if you use him as like a counter pick, but if you like just want to play him as like a generic option, he's just not that great at the moment as like a support pick because of the lack of good items, and he's being nerfed in the next patch, which will obviously, it's not support tailored, but it will have some level of effect for support. Galio, Shen, have him in the beta at the moment. I think if you can utilize him as a counter pick, he can be a pretty effective option. Like, I don't think these two picks are bad by any means if you have them in the right spots, but they're not picks which you can default on. They are pretty specific in where you want to play them, and Shen, that's usually into blind Leona. Wei is getting a pretty sizable buff next patch, worth watching for support. I think he's in a pretty solid spot at the moment. Honestly, might even get bumped up to the A tier next patch, so definitely a champion I would recommend looking at and maybe putting some time into if you enjoy that kind of playstyle. Seraphine support just isn't that great at the moment. Outside of Ashe pairing, I just don't really recommend it. She's like this jack of all trades, which just isn't that good in the current meta. But yeah, if you pair alongside the Ashe where you are getting more value out of your baseline kit, then I think she becomes a more viable option, and that is probably the spot I would recommend playing her in. Pyke benefited from Axiom Arc being buffed this patch, but is still the same champion. Like, you still have to pilot him really well. He's one of the hardest supports to pilot in the game, and one of the most elite skewed supports in the game, because you need to snowball early advantages, and if you're not comfortable with the champion, you should avoid him. If you're comfortable, then I think he's in a pretty solid spot as of the moment. Blitzcrank, I think, is a counter pick, quite good. I think it's just a blind hook champion, not as valuable. It's good into certain compositions where you can usually land consistent hooks onto the carry, like Senna's, for example, or like if enemy like blind Senna support, or plays in a mobile ADC, or plays like a mobile mid lane, like, then Blitz becomes more of a consideration, and that's where I'd probably recommend the champion. I think outside of that, he just becomes a bit... he's just not consistent enough, so yeah, I have him in the B tier in that regard. Swain, have him in the B tier. I think as a counter pick, he's fine. He's not a high B tier option. If anything, he's more of a low B tier option. Like, he's better as a support these days. He has a bit more individual agency, especially early on into the game, and he's still limited by the fact that you can't primarily want to pick him into compositions which have a hard time of like taking him down, so you can get as much value out of the ultimate as possible. Lux, over on the B tier, I think she's in a pretty solid spot at the moment, but she's I think she's probably a bit below the bar. If anything, she is a bit predicated on snowballing in her current state. And if you're not comfortable on snowballing, then the champion can definitely lose a substantial amount of its value. Plus, the fact that she usually gets paired alongside Caitlyn. I really dislike Caitlyn in the current meta. I think she's too demanding of like resources, and you need to excel at like too many things at the moment. And if you don't, then yeah, the champion becomes a lot weaker. Which is why Lux, a common pairing of the champion, ends up suffering a bit from that. Fiddle 6 is fine. Obviously, his pick rate's pretty heavily died down at this point, but I think if you can pilot Fiddle support, he still has a very powerful ultimate. He still has a lot of CC in his kit. He's just not the auto-win champion he kind of was when he was very, very strong. Xerath sits within the B tier. The Horizon Focus buff was nice. It makes it a competitive second item option. Shadow Flame, Storm Surge, Medjai's all look to be like options you can also opt into. Unlike Vel'Koz, which I think Horizon actually does just look like his best option to go. I think Xerath is a bit more like flexible and is a bit more flexible with what he can do in that regard. Zoe, I have her in the B tier still. The champion is, I think if you're piloting it really well, pretty good. Like, I think Zoe support is maybe even better than Zoe mid for like mid elo solo queue. I think the higher up you go, I think Zoe mid becomes better because your like the average skill level of the player is better, and I think Zoe mid is obviously going to be more demanding of the player than something like Zoe support. Same goes for like your LeBlancs, for example, where I think LeBlanc support's like a genuine and pretty good pick because you aren't like your mental stack isn't being taxed as much by being forced to CS and like just general laning in that regard. Nico in the B tier at the moment. I think if you excel at using her W and you understand kind of the reason why you're picking Nico to be this like early game bully and making sure you're getting push in lane, I think she can be quite good. Yeah, but she's pretty demanding of a champion, and that does pay some tax in the tier list. I think if you're going into elite, I think Nico still sits as like a really good A tier, maybe even S tier option. But for this bracket, I'm going to have her in the B tier at the moment. Dropping down from the A to the B tier, because I've shifted some champions up and I've just dropped down some of the lower A tier ones, is Maokai and Pantheon. And Maokai, I think at a surface level is like fine. I think if you don't want to put much time into the champion and just want to pick him in spots where you think Maokai support could be pretty good, seems pretty solid. But he seems like a champion which just isn't that good for investment. Like Maokai's investment curve is really low, and for that it's probably just not as recommendable as a champion. He's in a fine spot though at the moment. Like Trailblazer Maokai has always been a pretty solid champion. For that, I think he just sits as a solid like high end B tier, low end A tier option. As if I've just like tapped him down a bit in the tier list. Pantheon, I still recommend him over Pyke for like mid elo. That being said though, it's the gap's pretty close. Like it's not a large gap. Like I think if you want to opt into the Pyke over the Pantheon, that's fine. I just think Pantheon's a bit easier to play, as pretty clear win conditions of just like the point and click CC and then just comboing a target with like the ultimate for roams. I think that's pretty like understandable, and your team will usually like pretty clearly play around what your strengths are as a champion. But he's not as good as Pyke if like you're good at playing Pyke. So yeah, I'm gonna drop him down to the B tier alongside him at the moment. Moving up from the B tier to the A tier is Senna and Morgana. So Senna, I'm going to have her towards the low end of the A tier because she's still an inconsistent champion. I still think you want to find the right spots to pick her. But the string of buffs she's had over, like, I believe the last couple of months have been big for her. The E, I believe, got some CD reduction. The R gained some base damage. The W gained some base damage, and the mana cost is down. And overall, it's just made her a better champion. And for that, I'm just going to bump her up to the A tier. I think I would say she's a considerable option for support now if you want to play her. I would say the buffs are nice. Not much more to add on her. 20 healing on the Q is a good buff for this champion. Both the enchant build and the kind of just generic Senna build look pretty solid as options, and you kind of can flex depending on what you need within the game. Still within the A tier is the likes of Lulu. The string of nerfs she's received have only really dropped her from the S to the A tier. She's still a very good champion, paired alongside like the champion she wants to be paired alongside, like the on-hit marksman, or just even the crit marksman, which can like make use of the attack speed and the like steroids Lulu gives as a champion. I think she can still be a pretty solid option. But you want to be able to bully a bit out of lane with this champion. Like if you if you just sit back and kind of let your ADC do everything, she's definitely less valuable as a champion these days, because she needs to be more through the fact that her kit has definitely received nerfs as like because of its just generic strength. Well, not performing as well anymore. The two lots of nerfs she's received. The first one didn't do a huge amount. The second one did genuinely tag her a substantial amount. Seems to have like dropped her pretty close to the B tier. Like, she's no longer my number 1 recommendation. She's probably not even my number 2 recommendation for like engage support options. But she's still there, and I still think she like provides the same kind of stuff she previously did. She's just a bit less tanky. Like, she's lost a considerable amount of durability, so that is just something to consider. Ali also got nerfed. I believe it was 7 armor. He also now sits towards the low end of the A tier. He's still a good champion though, and I think if you understand how to combo correctly on him and like what kind of fights you're looking for, then yeah, I still consider him a pretty solid pick to have within your arsenal. Same goes for the likes of Braum and Rakan. I think Rakan has definitely benefited from other champions around him being nerfed, and now sits as like a pretty solid mid to a high end A tier option. Braum received it's like 12 net armor loss or something, so the champion is definitely considerably squishier, and I would only really recommend him as like a counter pick, but in counter pick scenarios he's still going to be a good champion. Shaco sits within the A tier. The AP build didn't get touched, they only nerfed the AD variation. I think AP Shaco is still a pretty good support pick, and I'm still going to leave him as like an A tier option. Nidalee is a slept on AP pick. I mean, AP enchant pick. Like, you want to bully out like champions in lane with this pick. Like, it's not enough just sitting back and being a heal bot. Like, she's still a good heal bot. Don't get me wrong. Like, that healer is one of the strongest steroids plus like just doing like heals in the game. With like missing health added on. The part of the pick though, yeah, comes from the fact that she has like the ability to do a lot of damage within laning phase, which makes her a very threatening option. I would recommend putting time into her if you want to learn her. I like, even if I think that's just like the baseline. Like, if you don't want to learn Nidalee, you don't have to. Like, people aren't like suddenly jumping to this champion as like the new meta thing, but I think she's a genuinely great pick to have within your pool, and people won't understand how to play against it. So, and it gives you like more individual agency. So I would genuinely like have her as like an A tier recommendable option. The other picks from the A tier include some of my other AP options, like Yella Blancs. I think she's better in support for solo queue because you don't have to think about as much, and you just have to focus on executing your combos and getting as much gold as possible from this champion. And she does a lot of baseline damage when you get access to that gold. Elise, also, same thing. I think if you don't need to think about how you want to play the map as a jungler, and you're just focused on landing the cocoon and then comboing correctly, also takes a lot of like your mental, and I think for like solo queue as well, I think, or like for this bracket of solo queue, I think Elise support is also just better to play. Vel'Koz, Brand, my other 2 AP options. Brand received a pretty sizable buff, makes him a genuinely competitive like support option now, especially in this bracket of play. He's now a decent pick again, thank God. And Vel'Koz is, with the Horizon Focus buffs, looks like a very solid option. He's also being buffed in 25.18. Vel'Koz will probably be an S tier support option next patch. Like, the buffs are huge. 2 seconds off E and like more base damage on ultimate later on to the game. Very, very meaningful. Like, that is going to definitely help the champion. Just gives him like more tools to work with later on. Yeah, Vel'Koz, I'm gonna definitely recommend him as like an A, at least an A at the moment. Maybe an S tier next patch. Might just hit as like the top of the A tier. It'll be interesting to kind of see where he lands, but definitely something worth considering. Tarek, I have him in the A tier. He's kind of just like a pretty standard A tier pick at this point. I think if you find spots where you're comfortable playing Tarek and like the pairings you want to pick him with, he can be pretty good. He's primarily just OTP'd though, and like if you don't want to play Tarek, you don't need to. I think there are loads of other options which can just work like around him, but he's a good champion to sink time into. Same goes for Zillion. Pretty similar concepts, where find champions you're comfortable playing him with. If you can get value out of the kit and you like are just comfortable playing the champion, he can be valuable in a lot of games, but he's not mandatory. You don't need to learn him. Like, once again, people aren't like jumping to like learn the pick, and yeah, that definitely just like allows him to be like this niche option within your pool. Poppy, I really like Poppy's support still. I think using her as a counter pick is still very effective, and she definitely deserves a spot in the A tier. She's also a great flex pick, being a very strong jungler at the moment, a decent top laner, not in the greatest of states, but still pretty solid up there. And yeah, I'd say she's a very solid A tier counter pick support option at the moment. Fresh, really been on the rise as of recent. Like, Fresh is genuinely like a top tier, A tier option at the moment. Like, I was considering putting it up to the S tier, but you also, like, you can look useless on Fresh. Like, you want to put time into him. Like, Fresh is a pretty heavily OTP champion. Like, a lot of the people who play Fresh are comfortable on the pick and understand, like, how they want to go about operating him. And I'd recommend sinking time into him. Like, Fresh is a rewarding champion to play at the moment, so definitely, like, something to consider. And I'd honestly have him as, like, a high-end A-tier option. The other picks towards the high end of the A-tier are Bard and Milio. And actually, there was one other, Soraka. Like, I think Bard and Fresh are definitely, like, towards the top end of my A tier. I think both these picks are in an incredible spot at the moment. The thing which kind of bars Bard as well, kind of akin to Fresh, if anything, is they are elite skewed champions. Like, they are champions you want to put time into. If you just play them at a selfish level, they will be less valuable than some of the other options you can opt into. Like, I would recommend playing Nautilus, who is, like, a mid A tier pick at the moment. But it's like also increasing value because he's like a flex option. But yeah, it's a bit easier to pilot than something like the Fresh or the Bard. In the case of Enchanters, I think Milio and Soraka are in great states at the moment. They're the kind of picks which usually will have value in most games. I wouldn't recommend blinding them per se, but you can get away with it, especially if like you have a good ADC pairing alongside them. But yeah, generally I think these are two very good picks at the moment. And then my S tier. So Leona is still here. I still think Leona is probably my number one like engage tank support option at the moment. She's very easy to play. Like, that is one of the kind of rewarding things about Leona, is you just don't need to put a huge amount of time into her, and as long as you find the games which you want to opt into her in, she can usually get good amounts of value. The other picks here include the likes of Sona and Janna, which, yes, I'm not the biggest fan of enchanters. I find people pick them traditionally or like these kind of enchanters, I think people traditionally pick them in a lot of spots where having an engaged support is definitely more valuable. That being said, though, I think if you find the right spots and you don't OTP these champions, because I think that is a rabbit hole which is not worth falling into, then they can be really valuable picks. Janna, for her peeling tools and like the steroid on her shield, is so valuable. Sona as like a champion, if you understand how to play the lane, when you get to the stages of the game where you can just take over support, is also really valuable. I think Nami and honestly Karma as well are both just incredibly good generic support options. They pair along really nicely alongside a lot of champions at the moment. Karma, I think, also just as a champion has a lot more agency because you can like utilize her to push waves early and trade a lot more effectively, and then fall back to the enchant pattern with like the 3 points Q Emax variant. I think Zyra is my number one like carry option at the moment. The buffs she received were really nice. No, she was already in good spot for support, but the buffs were like they added on and they like pushed her from the top of the A to like the S2 again. It was like ult base damage later on and ECD, which is really meaningful. Like getting access to your E more often so you can provide more utility is really, really big. Those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.